Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the PE Licensure in a Changing Landscape webinar. My name is Chris Miller. I'm the GM for School of PE. I also have along with me today Mr. Muhammad Algamal, who will briefly introduce himself here in a moment. But we just wanted, as things are changing, naturally the landscape, the introduction of AI, even the decoupling of, exam eligibility and work experience, we thought it'd be a great time to talk about some of these things that are changing the landscape in PE licensure, along with some other things. So, Muhammad, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the introduction, Chris, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. As Chris mentioned, I think just taking the opportunity to outline maybe some of our observations and the trends and all this just to better prepare and better align ourselves, not only for our professional development, but how do we leverage our professional development, the acquisition of the license to best get value for in the workplace. So with that, I think maybe we can start off. I'd like to, conduct this more of as an informal discussion more than anything. So there's going to be opportunities just to ask questions and put questions forth. But can I assume that the majority of us, maybe by a show of hands, if that feature is available, but on the track for looking at licensure, uh, wanting to be licensed, wanting to take our PEs or wanting to take our FE exams? Yeah. And maybe while we're also thinking about it, I mean, what is some of the discourse that's top of mind for you? Like, is your license going to be as relevant? Is your license going to be as effective? Is it worth the trade-off of all of the effort and all of my diligence and all of, my study in this generation, you would say, of everything that you put into it? These are some of the natural questions, and I think part of what I want to orient the discussion or just be able to outline or something, as a practitioner that I feel is important to qualify this discussion. A lot of this is dependent on the individual and what we're willing to expend from a diligence perspective. How can we leverage that being at the right time, being at the right circumstance? Obviously, we have perhaps challenges here in our emerging workforce and our dynamic landscape that weren't present 15 years ago. But 15 years ago, I can tell you what the challenge perhaps was. It was we were reeling back from the effects of the recession. And so hiring freezes across the board. How do people get hired when companies have a bleak or uncertain future? Do they still hire us? Do they still hire us with the hopes that, we can backfill those demands or those needs because we're going to eventually need it, or we hope that we're going to need it. So do we hire? And so coming through that storm, and I think every few years, and I've been told this from some of my mentors, and I'm sure you've also not only experienced this, but you've also heard the same thing, that there's going to be a shift in the landscape, something that's going to upend the markets, globally and specifically. So how do we adjust or position ourselves in spite of those challenges or that uncertain future to still get value, to still hold alignment and still work conducively for what we see for ourselves? Very good. I was having a conversation actually with a graduate student that's getting their graduate degree in civil engineering, undergraduate in architecture, and part of the discourse was, yeah, I've seen the output of what they can produce, or the firm that I was at has seen the output or what they can produce at the automated level for using these large language models to produce renderings that otherwise would have taken, and companies maybe are not ascribing as much value to the deliverables. And they thought to themselves, how do I position myself to still be resilient in the face of change or uncertainty? I'm going to use my skill set and position towards other pursuits. This is a very fair maybe decision to take, but I think that's all based off of the individual, where they are positioned, and are they positioned well in an environment where it's going to value their input, their contributions, their skill set, their certifications, their licensure, all the education that they put in. So recognizing this is maybe more, it's anecdotal, maybe it's speculative, but at the very least, we're using it to inform our understanding and we're taking this conversation offline. We're asking subject matter experts and industry leaders and thought leaders as to their read of the situation as well, because it is dynamic and things that, folks are so insistent on convincing themselves might not be the case in 2 or 3 years because of an emerging technology or an emerging approach or the way that the industry as a whole has responded to the needs or lack thereof of professional services. So one of the comments, Chris says, not having an FE in probably 7 years applicable to approve. Is it worth to get my P now or wait the 8 years? So a local license will go straight to the P without waiving. I think that's dependent. I think this is a great question, Chris. We're going to talk about this later on, so I'll be sure to integrate this. Uh, okay, and Manny gave his 2 cents about it. Okay, very good. All right. Uh, Chris, any other thoughts, questions? I think just to orient uh, before we kick off with the agenda.
No, I think that's a great place to start and at least get our feet wet.
Yeah, yeah. So the primary things that I just at the minimum, what do I want to cover today is what is licensure? A lot of us maybe uh, at least for civil engineers, this is part and parcel of like a career track. And this is a milestone that's almost considered either definitive if we're in the practice or we're heavily pressured. For the other engineering disciplines, there is value. There's absolutely value, and that's entirely dependent on our functions and our environments and who our primary service providers are and where we see ourselves. So, the licensure is for every discipline, for every engineering design group or engineering group. But primarily, we see the biggest volumes or the respondents or the active participants for licensure in the civil engineering category. So we're going to understand what licensure represents. We're going to look at some data from the examiners. Why is it in an institution? Why do we have it to begin with? And what does that institution mean in the dynamic landscape of today or on the contrast of the background of what we have today? As far as and then just pivoting the conversation towards additional considerations. So what have we been trending towards? As the academic, there's certain things that I've noticed also in the matriculated curriculum-based undergraduate engineering at the graduate level and at the superfluous training, or the extra professional, I should say, training that we see in PE prep, right? So there's all these trends that some of them have been convergent, some of them have been divergent. And which ones do we say there's patterns of how the candidate is evolving into the licensed individual and how that still stand muster according to the goals or the objective that licensure was instituted to protect. So we'll have an opportunity to have that discussion as well. And then also just talk about general exam expectations. I think for a lot of us, we're really keen on getting licensed. So what does that look like for seeing ourselves in that situation? How do we prepare? How do we best align? What are some best practices that we can use to just initiate and make sure our foot is on the right track? All right. If you have any questions, thoughts, commentary to share, please drop it in the chat. I'll be monitoring it. But to kick it off, what is engineering licensure? Recognizing that, or what is engineering licensure as the first question? Why would we need it? How do we acquire it? And maybe a question, does it place me at a disadvantage if I don't pursue it? Maybe the last one's a little bit of a loaded question, but we'll come to it and we'll be able to contextualize a little bit better. But licensure is that formal recognition, that legal recognition from an agency or a state board to be able to seal and to authorize engineering solutions. So imagine we have a solution to a need or to a problem. This authorizes the holder of the license to be able to say this satisfies the minimum requirements. Okay. Additionally, that it establishes the holder of the license possesses that minimum level of competency for the objectives of mitigating possible risk, safeguarding welfare, health, and the safety of the public. And this is a theme that we'll hear throughout when we're talking about licensure. Now, why would we need it? As a practitioner, can I be in the space without a license? Absolutely. Some of my best teachers were unlicensed. Some of the academics that teach licensure, teach about the core concepts of licensure, are unlicensed. That's not to say that we can still be effective in contributors. However, what we want to advocate for is that in a position of acquiring or possessing licensure, it enables us to maximize our potential for self, professional development, and for others. If we're talking about the welfare of the public, being licensure, being forward facing, this is part and parcel of the overall objective. Now, how do we acquire licensure? You might have heard of definitely the exam, and then there's some ambiguity or maybe misconceptions about the others. So the way that I like to categorize it is by three E's. Or you can see this before, see this in other publications. I didn't come up with it, but education, experience, and examinations. So the first one of education is that we're having some formalized training. And we're going to come back to this point, but that formalized training means that that training or the educational requirements meets the minimum standards of accreditation boards that work with industry leaders to ensure that degree holders possess the minimum coursework that enables them to start practicing, to enables them to start recognizing these bigger engineering concepts. Once we have the degree, the minimum is usually the undergraduate degree. It helps when you have advanced degrees, certainly from more than one way, outside of the value of the knowledge, but also decreasing from the overall requirements and having alternative paths towards licensure. But outside of having the undergraduate, then we transition to the experience. And that experience is also sometimes misunderstood. It's progressive engineering experience so that we see an increase in responsibility, an increase or a breadth and depth to certain subject matters. It's mentored and it's supervised by other engineers. It's applying codes and standards and practices. You're responsible for, we can say, design analysis to some degree, right? This is what engineering is, design or analysis. Now, it's not to say that every single engineer needs to always be in design and analysis, but it's saying the best and most formidable or the best one-to-one of what would qualify for most state boards on the approval basis is having adequate design and or analysis experience. All right. So once we have our experience, then we sit for our exams. Now, you could have taken, ideally, we're taking the FE in and around the 12 months milestone around graduation from our undergraduate. If that moment lapsed, that's fine. You can take it immediately after graduation. You can take it all the way up to your PE. And even in some circumstances, you can get the FE waived in your jurisdiction, assuming that you have some of the prerequisites, that you have satisfied the experience requirements and you've never taken the exam before. So, but ultimately, it's going to conclude with an examination of your principles and practice of engineering exam, which we refer to as the PE exam. All right. So that's how you would acquire it. Now, does it place me at a disadvantage if I don't pursue it? Any hot takes on this? Any thoughts? Any answers? What do you think? Depends on your career. Yeah, it depends on your career. I mean, as an actuarial scientist or as a doctor, this has no bearing or consequence on your functionality, your benefit, your yield, certainly. But if we're talking about we're engineers by education or we're engineers by trade, and we're tangentially related, explicitly or implicitly related to engineers in what we do daily, then yes, you can make the very clear argument there's a disadvantage if you don't pursue it, at least from the perspective of what positions are eligible to you. So supervising positions or project roles. Some clients or owners will dictate that a minimum of 15 years of PE with this license, working on these types of projects in comparable magnitude or complexity. You can't establish independent practice. Another thing that I think doesn't get as much, maybe in some settings where we have a lot of legal sensitivity, but at least in my jurisdiction and in a lot of other jurisdictions as well, the term engineer is a protected term. The same way that, as silly as it sounds, bank is a protected term. Someone that wants to institute a company can't open up a company and put bank in the title. Reason being, because it implies that you provide banking services. And if you don't provide banking services, it would be misleading and you're not a fiduciary, and this is going to be problematic. There's a legal implication. So you're precluded from using it unless you can prove that you have access to those systems and services. The same way we would say if you're using engineer as a protected term, and you might have heard this, in some locales, in some settings, and even in some company cultures, they're very stringent or strict on the term or the use of engineer. So generally speaking, we say some positions you're precluded from, some project rules, independent practice. I can't go and independently own. And the last thing is earning potential. We can make the argument, and I'll speak to some of the specifics, that yeah, over the time of your career, we're leaving hundreds of thousands of dollars on the table, hundreds of thousands of dollars in terms of differentials over the course of a career, maybe even millions. I don't know. All right. So this was some of our discussion on what is it. Let's talk about that legal authority and that responsibility. When we're talking about safety, we say safety means that the licensure ensures that the engineer adheres to the standards that safeguard the health, safety, and the welfare of the public. The safety of our infrastructure and our everyday lives depend on licensed professional engineers and surveyors who have successfully demonstrated a level of competence through those three E's, through education, experience, and examination. All right, so all of those requirements generally can confer that this person possesses that minimum to be able to carry out those functions and those tasks. There's an important distinction because when we're looking at these complex technical professions, even though technical professions and the trades that support them, right? This is the distinct, like we can work in those trades, we can support those trades, and those trades are vital to executing on those complex infrastructure or projects that we want to able to support to come to fruition. But there is a distinction between those support roles and what the engineer's role is, which is instituting, or we'd say creating those designs and creating those solutions and developing the vision and making sure that it's well within the standards of codes and practices and industry best practices. The other thing we would say, there's signing authority. So being able to designate and seal, and even at some companies, execute certain dollar amounts that's associated with certain contracts as a signing authority, be recognized as subject matter expert in legal capacities, being brought into like a court based off of a lawsuit. And they say, was this an actual trip hazard, for example? You can say this follows everything from all our associated codes and standards, and that the lip is actually within the tolerance, and this doesn't constitute a trip hazard because it falls within the tolerance. We talked about career opportunities, and I highlighted this before. Some owners or some clients may stipulate the project manager must possess a minimum 15 years, 20 years, 30 years of experience, or possess a license with 5 years of equivocal experience. So if we're pursuing contracts, RFPs, if these are terms that we're familiar with, then some of these have preclusions or pre-qualifications that limit us from the engineering perspective. We said independent practice, going into our independent practice. Lastly, in terms of employment growth, I'll talk more about this in the next slide regarding where the trend of our industry is going. But in respective to other disciplines, we continually see or expect to see 20% margins of our growth in our licensed engineering counterparts and their non-licensed counterparts. So in terms of how we grow year over year, and this is outside of the automation risk discussions that we want to break into as well, earning potential. So median salaries if we're talking about meeting salaries for licensed engineers, anywhere from 100 to 150, and which is good, which is great. I shouldn't underwhelm that because if we're talking about average salaries and where we could have been otherwise, I think it's important to just put it in context and perspective. But we're appreciating on a globally or nationally on our standards, $30,000 differentials yearly to the non-licensed counterparts. In terms of global recognition, possessing a PE standard or possessing a PE license confers that you have a standard that sometimes is transferred to other locales and states and jurisdictions outside of the United States. So if we're talking about multinational corporations, if you want to work overseas or abroad, they're using standards like have the PE or the PEng or CEng from Canada and UK. So because most states or most countries don't necessarily have their own licensing boards or council of examiners the same way that we have. So they use that standard equivocally. All right. Some of the meat and potatoes that we probably came here for that I want to dig into a little bit more um, is, how do we view the role of these organizations across the board? Now, we might have heard of these organizations, but I think understanding who the stakeholders are will allow us to contextualize the change in the landscape and what are their interests and what are we trying to protect in the background of all things. Um, all right. So ABET, we might have heard before. ABET is the accrediting organization for engineering and engineering technology programs, if you will. Or there is another sister organization for engineering technology programs, but it's to ensure that we meet the minimum level of requirements and curricula in these matriculated programs to get us to the start line for our engineering careers. This is the minimum, right? Now, is there some vested interest to making sure that there's an alignment with ABET and the National Council of Examiners for Engineers and Surveyors, NCS? Absolutely. Because when we finish our undergraduate degrees, what exam are we taking? In and around the end of our undergraduate tenure, what exam are we taking? Question for folks, the FE. Absolutely. And this is designed for undergraduate students who are completed or close to completing or finishing their undergraduate engineering degrees. And so imagine if we were preparing folks using a different metric in ABET that is going to be assessed differently or alternatively altogether from NCS. Then you're just like, you guys are not talking to each other and you're preparing us and you're setting us up for something else. Like there's a misalignment here. We need to reconcile this. So absolutely there has to be conversations, concurrences, and memorandums of understanding of this is and joint efforts and programming that is done to ensure that there's an alignment at the educational level all the way to the professional and licensure level. Now, past this point, outside of our professional societies, whether they're ASCE or ASME or of the like, I wanted to highlight NSP because NSP has a vested interest in protecting professional engineering licensure for all disciplines across the country. Now, they have a vested interest in ensuring that we always meet that minimum standard, that minimum criteria, that we're safeguarding and we're protecting the welfare and we're doing what we need to do and staying on par without compromising the integrity of the license. The state boards also have a mutual and overlapping interest as well. The state boards also offer a different perspective. The state boards want to not only protect from liability and safeguard public, but there's an interest in allowing people, maybe there's a free market perspective as well to be considered. And then there's others. Then there's other agents in the space, organizations or individuals, stakeholders that may have not only tangential, divergent, and antithetical pursuits to licensure as a whole. So as engineers, I would advocate proudly of why we need licensure and why it's an institution that we have to not only continue to protect, but continue to bolster. Other organizations, maybe with the pursuit of enabling free market enterprise, will say, we have too much regulation. You have X amount of years and it's incredibly cumbersome. And why won't you make an exception? If I've been practicing engineer, just let me, walk through the door. And we're not necessarily saying walk through the door without some sort of checks and balances, but maybe they're advocating for some middle ground. And there is middle ground. If you look at most state boards, they're not all on the same spectrum. If we look at the history, NCS publishes the model law. The model law is to be used by state boards to be able to minimize or establish the minimum standards and criteria that all engineers should conform and abide to, from their education requirements, their experience requirements, their engineering requirements. When can they sit for the exam? How do you balance ABET accreditation, non-ABET accreditation, overseas or abroad undergraduate institutions, and how do you get them? So all of these things they explore on the model law. So they offer this model law as a template to be used by state boards, to be enhanced upon, or to be built upon. And this is revised, every now and then, or periodically, and adopted by state boards as needed. Back to the point of other organizations that can be antithetical to protecting the institution of licensure, maybe their perspective or their objective is deregulation to help and aid in free market enterprise and free market pursuit, to allow people that are qualified, maybe in other regulated industries, to have access to those professions that are otherwise protected. So it's not necessarily directed towards engineers, but some of them are broad sweeping legislations or laws that are trying to be enacted that we would consider, or NSPE would consider, and I would consider as well, a legitimate threat to licensure, because it erases some of that rigor that's required to assess and, what we say, ultimately protect and safeguard the interest of the public. Now, how do we understand this? From what is the minimum level of competency? You'll hear me refer to this as one of the standards that NCS seeks to assess through our examination. And I think some healthy alignment up front is really healthy alignment up front is necessary and vital to ensuring that our efforts are conducive. Because more often than not, when we are approaching the exam, we're approaching it with the perspective that we would like to see, some one-to-one comparisons of what we see in practice, or one-to-one comparisons of how would I approach this problem at work. And that's not what the exam actually will be, right? It's validating a defensible minimum standard of competency across a broad integrated knowledge base. So we have multiple knowledge areas, many subdomains, and all of these subdomains, as they are integrated, they're assessed in this psychometric or this exam vacuum or this exam module. And it's all for the purposes of what? Assessing this minimum floor of competency that all engineers must possess. It's not to say where you should be at the highest level, it's the minimum of what everyone needs to possess. All right. And so this, we'll revisit this point, but this is such an important point because just understanding the context of an exam is everything. Because maybe we stress it and maybe you'll get that pressure. But then when you go to the exam, you're like, this makes no sense. Why am I approaching it this way? This is not how I would do it at work. Well, because the value proposition and the value add wasn't that this was going to be a one-to-one, but this is a way to analyze if you have and possess the minimum intellectual and critical thinking and problem solving skills from an engineering context to navigate these problems in this curated window. If I have an opportunity, and maybe I won't later on, but before I forget, if we look at the initial iteration of the exam, I think this will be very clear. The initial exam, for anyone that remembers it, does anyone remember the original mode of how the exam was presented? Right now, we have 80 questions over 8 hours, with most of them being multiple choice and some alternative item types. So you have some fill in the blanks, but they're numerical fill in the blanks. You have some matching, click on the region, things of that nature. Does anyone know or has heard of the previous version or the initial version of the exam? What did it look like? Any thoughts? Or was a written exam? Yeah. Before even pen and paper or pencil and paper, pencil and paper, that's, yeah, I took it in pencil and paper. Before it was pencil and paper, it was pencil, paper, and multiple choice. Before that iteration, it was 8 questions. Excellent. Very good, Jacob. It was an open-ended exam. It was 8 questions, each of, if you can think about it, 8 questions, multiple part, and you had to show work. You had to show work, and partial credit was awarded, obviously, and it had to be follow a sequence of operations, best practices, design methodologies. You would have to go through designing any of these designs, which would be representative of maybe something that you would see at work. No problem. Great. Now the downside to this is how relevant is this, A, for niche practitioners that are only involved in maybe one of the disciplines? Okay, fine. That's not that big of a deal because maybe we have to have an awareness or situational integration of how other disciplines may be related to us in our practice. No difference of opinion. Let's overlook that. Logistically, if I have a demand of 100,000 engineers per year or 50,000 engineers per year nationally, can I adequately backfill that given the amount of resources that I have, given the amount of testing time and grading period that I need? It becomes extremely hard to benchmark and to establish a basis or an objective basis in that methodology and to still provide that requisite supply to the demand of the workforce. So maybe from a logistical perspective and from a grading perspective and a standardization perspective, they adopted a different methodology of assessing the competency, which is we're going to inundate you with volume, we're going to inundate you with concepts, we're going to inundate you with semi code based and non code based problems, and we're going to see how you leverage it over the course of 8 hours. So we still have the testing time, but now the modality is a little bit changed. And instead of being representative and showing the explanations of your work and showing the credence and having engineers to backfill and grade those elements, now we can run it through a computer. We can run some algorithms to find what the outliers are. We can find what the true test is. We can back solve for where the cut score should be. And then we can say, okay, how many people pass based off of this assumption? So those are and I think we hit one end of the pendulum. If you tell me how, like I've been looking at it for years, the multiple choice was the most extreme and probably divergent end of it. And now we've kind of come back from it. So now how do we respond to the adjustment of the exam in light of we want to be able to offer authentic assessments in the academic space? Authentic assessments are best open-ended form, but they also inundate the grader and the reader by being able to discern and understand, what the answer contained or entailed. And that usually is a drain of resource. It's not to say it's worthwhile, but how do you scale that up appropriately on a national or international platform? So these are some of the challenges that we saw in its first iteration. We went to one end of the pendulum, and I think coming back with the alternative item types and how the exam is being refined in its last iteration with its exam specification update to address the needs of the engineer. Because previously, I'll give you one example of how we've been coming back off of the extreme end of the pendulum. We all used to be tested uniformly. And then they said, wait, should we be testing them uniformly? Does a structural engineer need to know all this environmental mitigation and abatement strategies that we see otherwise? So no, let's omit some of this environmental topic. So we saw decoupling of some environmental topics from all of the disciplines. And then we said, okay, in the last iteration, 2024, we said, let's repackage this. Let's make every specification unique to that discipline group and make sure that they have equal part principles and practice, right? So principles, concepts, and application. And let's remove some of the things that were extraneous or maybe divergent. But anything that's still relevant, let's keep it in there. That's still relevant or still within the sphere of influence for their practice. Now, some of the things that, I've noticed just from my intersection of academia and practitioner and seeing students on both sides of it, are we doing our diligence by aligning our students academically? Is there enough of a presence of what does it look like to be licensed in the classrooms? I'm talking about the undergraduate level. And I would say no. I mean, if they're push, I'm just giving you my frank impression of it. I think there needs to be more balance. Obviously, most academics can't be practitioners, or they can do so to a limited degree. But are they mostly interfacing with clients and owners and municipalities and agencies? No, they do so on, I had one of my dear professors who retired, I'll Professor John Schuring. This was a generational academic and a generational practitioner. His wall was littered with patents in terms of mitigation strategies and things that he effectualized in industry that were expected, that were adopted for mitigating brownfield sites and things of the nature. And I still remember it to this day. Uh, he was an exception. So where do we stand in academia? I think integrating the relevance of practitioners, because when you ask someone, or you ask, and I've surveyed all my students over the years, a few thousand students at the undergraduate level, raise your hands. How many of you seem to want to go into academia, like long term, as getting your doctorate and advanced degrees and postdoctoral research and et cetera? And maybe at the time, over the course, I can remember two or three hands that were raised. There's no shame in that. And usually that's the percentages. You need more performers than you do teachers. But if most of us are performing, how are we aligning our expectations in the classroom to make sure that what we're learning at the concept level is mastery that should be leveraged for practice and not just this silo. And so there has to be an appreciation from both lens of it. Just the same way that a design professional needs to understand constructability requirements, and the same way that a contractor must understand design intent, an academic must understand its relevance in practice, and a practitioner must understand its relevance and its origins in theory. And we have to be able to marry these things. We cannot split them. The responsibility of every agent is to harmonize them. So all this to say, can we be doing more work in aligning expectations? Absolutely. And if you've attended a class with me, or if you've heard me perhaps speak to this in other settings, every class that I start off with in PE or FE level is just talking about the expectations. Because I think we come into it with a lot of genuine bias that is not always bad consideration. But how do we then bring this to our efforts? Because if the litmus and the criteria for evaluating or responding to a question is, how would I solve this at work? More often than not, you might get the wrong answer. Because, very quick anecdote or example, if you're looking at a quantity takeoff exercise and you're just enumerating or quantifying the amount of materials necessary for a project, why don't I just pick the largest magnitude if they're all very close to each other? I'm not saying they're beyond 5% with each other, but they're very close. They're precise. Why don't I just pick the largest one? Wouldn't that be the most conservative? Technically, that's the truth. No problem with that, right? But the issue is that the examiners are not looking for you to give the conservative answer of what you would do in practice. They're looking for you of what you would respond with for the exam environment that's going to demonstrate that you have a computational basis, and that answer, that reported answer, is proportionate to your calculated answer. And there was a logic of decision making that went from there to there. All right. Now, as far as some things that we touched on, and I just want to be able to summarize and give an opportunity for questions and an open forum, but where do we see the demand for engineers and the workforce and the projections? If you look at any engineering craft, it's always outpacing average workforce. It's always outpacing average workforce in terms of their demand. And when they go unfilled, some of the data that we look at even further beyond this point, when it goes unfilled, we realize that there's a direct correlation or an indirect relationship with the economic benefit or GDP stimulus. And when I say indirect, I mean when one thing increases, the other decreases. So this is unfortunately one of the consequences when these roles get unfilled. As far as the changing landscape, ironically enough, this was something that there was a great graph, and I'm sure a lot of us have watched and seen some of those trends and graphs and looked at the risk of automation for engineers. If we were to plot engineers in terms of the risk of automation or automation potential, we're more resistive than many trades, many trades. And I would say, if I had to plot it on a scale of out of 100%, in being the most insulated, we're nothing less than 85. We're nothing less than 85%. Now, there are some processes that can be automated, and we should leverage them the same way that we leverage the advantages of calculators and design tools as opposed to using a slide rule or a design wheel. The same way that we went from hand drafting to automated and AutoCAD. And I'm not saying this is the same jump, but it's an innovation. Can it be used to supplant the engineering roles? I would qualify on this basis. What are the qualities that are difficult to automate? And are we trending towards those qualities? I would say originality, understanding how do we use limited resources. A lot of our infrastructure is aging. So how do we rehabilitate in consideration of an existing problem and leveraging the most effective and the most efficient or the optimal use of our resources? A large language model can develop a new problem or a new solution from scratch, but integrating it is still have a lot to be desired. And how companies on the cutting edge are leveraging them to be able to drive down costs, fine, by all means. But in terms of audit, in terms of liability, in terms of culpability and responsibility, and the agents or the stewards of that infrastructure, it'll always be an individual. And I always hope, or it would be a sad day when a person or another human isn't responsible for the impact of another human. And we're just relegating it to standards, or we're relegating it. There has to be some sort of component, at least from my personal philosophy. And all this to say, what are the qualities that are difficult to automate? The originality, that creativity, how we read those social cues and perceptiveness. If when we're working with clients, when we're working with agencies and stakeholders and the public, being able to read what's important to them, being able to persuade, being able to negotiate. These are things that, yes, you can leverage with empirical tools and facts and present those as arguments. But something is to be said when we're leveraging our interpersonal skills to deliver those solutions. And more often than not, just because you know the right answer doesn't mean I want to learn from you, doesn't mean I want to take what you have to offer. I care for a human connection. And we see that in the workforce. We were just talking to some students about the importance of balancing emotional intelligence and our intelligent quotient. Not everything is just being correct, but it's also conveying a message. Our best instructors, our best teachers were ones that left something in us and not just gave us something and said, study this book. They inspired us and they showed us and they led by example. So, this is maybe tangential, but I think it's a relevant point to the conversation. When we're talking about working pressures driving productivity, we want to see more results. I mean, if you have shareholder expectations always at the bottom line of every time we're doing a project, it's going to get greedy. And this is the consequence of it. And so they're going to look to penny pinching. And sometimes those penny pinching approaches are not the best decisions. And we're going to only find out in hindsight. And so, how do we position ourselves for relevancy? How do we position ourselves to be resistive to the dynamic change? Invest in yourself. And this is a personal philosophy independent of School P that I've always promoted. You have to, the licensure is not something that you give to your employer and they return for you a $5,000 check or an $8,000 check and say, congratulations, you got your exam and now I can bill my clients at a higher rate and you're dragging your feet the whole time. No, the licensure is something that represents a milestone in your education, in your experience. It signifies all the things that we discussed about. And it's something that we should be proud of, that I achieved this milestone after all is said and done. And so it's something that you take with you from any place, immaterial of where you end up working. Recognizing the only thing, and I'd like to summarize this point by saying focus on what we can control. In spite of the dynamic and the changing and the mounting pressures that we have in our landscape, what you can control is how much you build resistance to those changes, or how you build resilience to those changes, and how you invest in yourself. And that interpersonal and professional development that you take is something that is going to be independent of anything else, right? And it'll position us hopefully for appreciating those benefits when the dust has settled and we figured out how to integrate all of these things and it's not as dynamic. All right. Um, I also wanted to just talk about, and maybe this is the last summarizing point to this element, but engineering licensure is not just this academic exercise. When we look at preparation and best practices, and when I talk to my students and I align those expectations up front, and then I back end it with how we should be going to the exam, how should we be preparing, we say that it requires not only disciplined problem solving, understanding what the testing environment expects of us, mastering our time management, and mental endurance for 8 hours. For the FE, it's 5.5. Guess what? In an environment, in another generation, it used to be 8 hours. And they've truncated it and increased the threshold. So it's a little bit more speed rounds, which is fine. But we still have the PE. These are longer examinations than they're shorter. All this to say, these are learned skills, and they're developed through structured practice and feedback, and not necessarily just a passive consumption of information, maybe like the way that we appreciated or went through some of our coursework at the undergraduate level. All right. Is there a minimum passing score based off of the results for others taking the exam? So, a great and common question. One of the things is it's variable, and I can talk about this, but it's benchmarked according to the average passing candidate, to the average passing candidate. All right. As far as the FE, because we have a few moments and I just want to open up the floor for discussions in the last 10 minutes, but I just wanted to aggregate and recap some of those elements that we talked about. But what do we see here? Pardon me. It's designed for recent graduates who are close to finishing or finished an undergraduate engineering degree, right? And for the principles in PE exam, it tests for a minimum level of competency. It is designed for engineers who have gained a minimum of 4 years post-college work experience in their chosen engineering discipline. Now, this is data directly from NCS, what I presented and what I'm presenting here. This is a popular graph that I'll usually start off all our lectures with. But if we said that engineering experience has a direct corollary, which I believe it should have more, this is maybe one of the points that we need to work on in the future. If engineering experience and bona fide engineering exposure has a direct corollary, meaning the more you stay in the industry, it would say that our pass rates are higher than when you're not in the industry, then we should see an uptick in this graph. But rather, what we see is that it peaks at the 4 or 5 year mark. And maybe it's because we can get licensed at that time. There's a confirmation bias. Everyone's eligible. So this is maybe the peak balance between being close to our undergraduate experience at the BS level and being tenured on the other side of the spectrum. What I failed to mention, 0 years of experience, 11 plus years of experience. This is 4 to 5 years of experience. So it peaks, your statistical advantage peaks at 4 to 5 years of experience. The more important element here that I just want to be able to highlight is that if we said, ironically, experience correlated to pass rate, then 11 plus, you should see higher pass rates. But paradoxically, people with 0 years of experience have statistically higher odds of passing the PE exam than people with 0 years of experience, or with 11 years of experience, pardon. And in another iteration of this graph, this actually went up this way. And I think they corrected some of their anomalies, or they looked at redicing it up. The left side of the curve should be lower than the right side of the curve. If it's going to be normally distributed and it's going to peak at 4 to 5, then the right side of the curve should be higher. At least there's a bias for experience than there is for lack of experience. So what we're essentially telling people is if that you can study, you can kind of go through the synthetic motions of it, you can prepare for it. And unfortunately, that's sometimes how we have to level with preparation. So should it be more authentic? Should we know how to marry these things? If you're a pure test taker, can you pass this exam? No. If you're a pure engineer, can you pass this exam? No. You should be able to marry both of these things. Now, whether the split is 65-35, 50-50, that's up for conjecture or up to every individual candidate and maybe a secondary discussion. But I thought this was a very interesting piece of data that I wanted to share for you. And then on the back end of the supplemental reference, just talking about what is entailed in that CBT environment. We said 110 questions, 80 questions for the FE and the PE respectively, over 5.5 hours roughly, and 8 hours for the PE. They update the reference handbooks. They're in a closed reference-based environment, so you only have the material that you can cite or bring up on their end. And then as far as exam specifications go, this is how we orient what is going to be on the exam. So on the exam, you have reference handbooks I mentioned. So this is some of the samples. Interesting point enough, one of the things that they say right here is the PE Civil Reference Handbook, and also with the FE as well, does not contain all the information required to answer every question on the exam. Theories, conversions, and formulas and definitions that examinees are expected to know have not been included. So this is common engineering practice. This is common engineering knowledge. This is the relationship of specific gravity. This is what it means when we're trying to calculate yield using mass, right? So these are some of the things that you should know that are not necessarily coded in the external references. As far as the specifications go, as you look at it, from chemical to water resources for civil, all the way to the FE, you'll see all of these subjects and the associated question range for those subjects. And then when we're talking about more intensive practice, which this is where we're talking about practical exposure, the practical exposure is how do you use these design standards to answer these questions? So using your geometric design of highways and streets from AASHTO, or using your MQTCD, or using ACI 318, or using ASCE 37. How do you use these codes in practice, and what is the expectation on the exam? And to the common question, scoring, this is it's computed on a linear on-the-fly algorithm. That's how they refer to it. And how I read this is the relative credibility of a question is either promoted or demoted. So if average passing candidates all get this question correct, then it's good. Let's keep cycling it in. And when people get it wrong, it's counted against them. Now, most questions will count against you or for you, but if they're learning to calibrate a certain question on its credibility, they have to look at pre-testing it first. And that's usually a minimum number of questions on the exam are not graded. And that's where we see the pre-test environment. You don't know where they exist. Let's say that we can speculate 10 questions, at least on the PE, a little bit more or a little bit less on the FE. And those are the questions that are going to calibrating future iterations of the exam. In another setting, I would love to, and I think if I can welcome you to hopefully one day joining us in one of our classes, I will talk about best practices for exam preparation. And maybe you can infer what the end result of some of these bullets would ask you to do, but I can definitely elaborate them, in another setting. And then I also have a slide dedicated, or the best practices also include some of the strategy tips as well. And so these are some of the references. And if Chris, maybe in the last few minutes, if there's anything that you wanted to highlight about some of the services that we offer or some of the courses that we offer.
Yeah, thanks, Mohammed. Hey, thanks everybody for joining. I know we're coming up across on time. Just appreciate the time. Hopefully this was beneficial to everybody that's either in the path towards licensure or considering it. Only thing I want to leave on, and maybe Mohammed, you can touch on this, is as people talk about, changing the landscape, a lot of times we're focused on like the changing in technologies or the bringing into of new technologies, and people don't really take into consideration how the landscape changes when exam changes.
Yeah.
In the last couple of years, we saw PE civil change. Last year, we saw the three mechanicals and the PE power. So as these exams become more, I'm going to say discipline specific or geared towards what an engineer does do on their day-to-day basis, does that change or should that change your mindset on how you prepare for the exam? Meaning, like, should you wait longer because you want to
Yeah.
accumulate more work experience, or is the current path still the way to go? So, Mohammed, if you would please.
Yeah, I'll keep it short and sweet. I think is having an appreciation for how we tested academic environment at our undergraduate levels and having exposure to seeing how those concepts play out in real life and being able to marry those things. So when we bring those two things together, I think that's the ideal candidate. Now, if you're on either end of the spectrum on the extremes, just compensating for that. So if you haven't been as tenured in the workforce, then getting some of that exposure. What does it look like in practice? Asking about terms that don't seem relevant or you've never seen before. I don't know what an invert is. I don't know why the invert is relevant for calculating my slope of this pipe. Why is it benchmarked from the invert than the outside of the pipe? That makes more sense because I'm constructing it from the outside. So certain things will not make sense unless we've seen it in practice. And if we've been in practice for so long, recognizing that there is something to appreciate about how we academically assess for concepts. We don't throw out a whole book just because it doesn't have a practical counterpart. Statics was all a figment of our imagination for the most part. If we looked at a simply supported beam and a point load at center span, that point load occupies no space. Does that mean because I don't have a point load that can occupy no space in practice, then there's no point to analyzing this problem? No, it was to recognize a pattern, it's to understand a trend, it was to understand a theory, a concept, or a conversion, and then be able to scale it to our practical environment. So just marrying those two things. So ultimately, just to recap, I know it's short and sweet. I think if we can have a balance of both of these realms, 4 to 5 is the sweetest. If we're a little bit past it, there's no time like the present. If we're a little bit before it, maybe you can wait. Maybe you can wait.
Thanks, Mohammed. And the last thing I kind of want to touch on is there's a large group here today, and I'm sure a lot of people are in different parts of their journey, right? Some of you are maybe with School of PE now as you're preparing for your exam, or again, maybe some of you have gone through School of PE and came here to learn about the path to licensure. Just if there's anyone that wants, outreach after this webinar, please don't hesitate to reach out to School of PE. They'll connect you with either myself or Mohammed, because everyone's journey is individual. And if you're seeking a little bit more deeper detail or deeper dive, we're definitely here to support that. So again, thanks everybody for sticking around or for attending. And we're happy to stay around for a few minutes after. I know, Mohammed, you have a class to jump to here in a few minutes, but
Yeah,
if you have questions, feel free to
I can
unmute
stay around for
yourself.
a few minutes.
Thanks, Mohammed.
Absolutely. Yeah,
But yeah, if
absolutely.
anyone has any questions, throw them in the chat window or feel free to unmute yourself, and we're happy to take a few minutes to
Yeah,
answer
I'll
those
see. There's
questions.
some questions in the chat.
Thanks, Mohammed.
Yeah, absolutely. For what PE subjects? Usually construction, the construction module, and some construction topics from water resources, and some from transportation. And then at the FE level, kind of similar. Uh, uh, how it's graded. Look, Joel, I just want to repivot the focus. I think you can look at how it's graded, but I'd love to be overachieving like in this regard because the thing is on exam day, you want every amount of contingency to be able to mitigate any fallouts or not having those protections in place. So what does that mean? Shooting for the stars on this one, doing what we can control. I think fixating too much on how close was I, or I think it's arbitrary and subjective at times. And I think just taking a tailored approach to creating a disciplined and diligent study plan is key. Because if you focus on the process long enough, and I promise, and this happens more often than you'd think, you're not going to care about what the grade is. You're going to go in and you're going to be like, I'm leaving it all on the table. Whatever I get, I get. And that's the end of it. And I'm not going to be chasing around like, how do I budget my effort to get the minimum amount of resource? I think invest in yourself and withdraw it, take out all the money and bet the house on it, So, um, if anyone has any other questions, you're very welcome, everyone. If you have any other questions, put it in the chat. Otherwise, please reach out to Chris or our School of PE team. I make myself available to any students, pending they're just patient with my scheduling. But texting, calling when opportune is always something that I can offer for your particular circumstance. So, Muhammad, if it's Muhammad or Muhammad, the if from Afghanistan, okay. Yeah, for repeat takers, something that we have to just like put into context. It happens, but we have to be able to diagnose first and foremost, what could we do differently? Because if we're going into it with the same kind of tool bag and we're coming out with the same results, we have to ask ourselves, is there a differential that I can make? Because I think independent of whatever suggestions I can offer, we want to make those suggestions sustainable. And the only way to make them sustainable is we have to be able to identify some of those target areas first, and then we'll build on them. So I welcome any follow-up conversations after, offline, and then we can take it from there. My LinkedIn, you know what? I don't have a LinkedIn. I don't have a LinkedIn. I'm proud. I don't have any social media. And uh, that's it. I got a phone number.
All right. Any other questions before we wrap up for the day? The recording will be made available to everybody. I believe they'll email it out. But again, if anyone has any questions after today, please feel free to reach out to Mohammed and I. I can always find Mohammed even though he's not on social media. So if anyone needs any help, happy to connect you with Mohammed, whether
Yeah,
it be exam tips and strategies or just talking about how to start your journey. We're happy to talk about that as well. But again, thank you everyone for coming out. I know we're a little bit over. If anyone has any questions, maybe we'll give another, I don't know, 3-4 minutes, Mohammed, to give
yeah.
some individuals to throw out some questions, whether it's in
Sure, sure,
chat
sure,
or
sure.
through the mic. All right, looks like maybe we are out of questions, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Mohammed, thank you so much for
Yeah,
for joining and leading this discussion, and everyone else, thank you so much for taking your time out this afternoon. Again, any questions or anything, please feel free to reach out. Have a great afternoon and enjoy the rest of the week. And take care, everybody. Thank you so much.
have a good one. Take care, Ryan. Ryan, I don't know if did you want to unmute or you're just waving? Maybe that's a wave. Okay.
No, I just wanted to thank you very much. I'm currently taking your course online. I really appreciate the way you go through each
You're
topic.
so welcome. You're so welcome. Keep up the good work. If you need anything, if there's anything I can help with, reach out.
And,
And
and you're
again,
100% accurate when you said everybody's journey is different. It's I have an experience level as how I was qualified to take the test, or as I'm scheduled to take the test in August.
yeah,
And I'm glad I'm taking your course pre-recorded because I can pause it at any time and
yeah.
continue notes, rewind it multiple times, play it over and over and over.
Yeah, I honestly, Ryan, if there's a sentiment that I would close the discussion with, I think there's no better one than what you just mentioned, is just making this about yourself. Look, are you going to tell me I never had frustrations in my preparation with myself or the systems that I had subscribed to? Absolutely. But I had to decide whether I was going to let those circumstances define the outcome or I was going to control what I can control, which was if it was a function of effort and time, even though I was an underperformer or below par, no, I was gonna invest every amount of energy. My whole family was on notice. Like there's nothing that I'm gonna do other than study for this thing over the next 2 or 3 months. And that was, the better part of a decade ago. And I still remember it. It's seared in my memory. Those transactions that I have of investing in myself and making sure that I was escalating my commitment and I was putting my money where my mouth is, was everything. And so expecting more from ourselves is such a critical thing. And I think it's the mentality shift, like you mentioned, is just like owning it and just making it about yourself and taking the benefit and then leaving the not so uh, 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 relevant things, if you will.
I appreciate you sharing your experience.
Absolutely,
Thank you very
absolutely,
much.
man. If you need anything, absolutely hit me up. we'll take the conversation offline, but
I will
best
do.
of
I
luck.
scheduled my exam in August, so I gave myself a lot of leeway there.
Awesome. Awesome.
Appreciate you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Have a good one, Ryan.
All right.
Hi, sir.
Oh, hey, Mohammed, how are you?
Hi, how are you? Uh, my name is Hamidullah. I graduated from Afghanistan University, Kabul Polytechnic University in 2006. But since on that time up to 2024, I was far from the education program.
Yeah,
But
Hamidullah,
yes,
I saw your response. How about this? Can I advise or recommend that reach out to our School of PE team and they'll get you connected with me and then we can have a conversation. Tomorrow evening, afternoon would probably be that's probably my next availability, unless you want 10 p.m. Eastern tonight. But we can definitely talk.
okay. How can I join with that?
Email in there and then we.
Sure.
Yeah, you're very welcome, Hamidullah.
Yeah,
There
so
you
if
go.
you send an
The
email to
info at School of
info
PE.
and then just tell them, hey, I'd like to get connected with Mohammed, they'll get you connected with them.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you for attending.
You're most welcome, sir.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Motion to adjourn.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Mohammed, thank you so much. And again,
Yes.
thank you for attending. Have a great afternoon. Take care, folks.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Take care.